Hey guys, tonight we're going to push back through 8 centuries of medical history to uncover something your doctor probably never mentioned. We're stepping into the dim, herb-scented world of medieval apothecaries, where physicians used 12 extraordinary remedies that modern science has proven work better than many of our pills. These weren't just folk tales or desperate superstitions. These were sophisticated medical interventions that healed people for hundreds of years, then vanished from our medicine cabinets under circumstances that were anything but scientific. Before we dive into this world of forgotten cures, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find these journeys into lost knowledge valuable. And let me know in the comments what time it is for you right now and where you're joining us from. It's always fascinating to see how our community spans continents and time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe brew a cup of herbal tea if you have some, and let's ease into tonight's exploration together. The year is 1292. In a monastery infirmary somewhere in the rolling hills of Provence, a physician named Brother Thomas carefully crushes dried willow bark in a marble mortar. His patient, a local farmer, writhes in agony from the joint inflammation that has made every movement torture for 3 months. The brother mixes his powdered bark with honey, wine, and a precise amount of water, then administers it to the farmer with prayers and precise instructions for how often to take this bitter medicine. Within 2 weeks, the farmer walks out of the infirmary almost pain-free, able to work his fields again. What Brother Thomas didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that he had just administered one of the most effective anti-inflammatory compounds in human history. A substance that wouldn't be isolated and synthesized for another 600 years. He called it simply, the bark remedy. We call it aspirin. This story repeats itself across medieval Europe, the Islamic world, and Asia, but with a crucial difference. The physicians of the Middle Ages worked with whole plants, complex mixtures, and preparation methods that preserved hundreds of active compounds working in concert. Modern pharmaceutical science, however, demands single isolated molecules that can be patented, mass-produced, and sold at enormous profit margins. And so began one of the greatest disappearing acts in medical history. The systematic elimination of remedies that actually worked in favor of synthetic alternatives that were, in many cases, less effective and more dangerous. What we're going to uncover tonight isn't romantic nostalgia for a supposedly simpler time. This isn't about abandoning modern medicine for some rustic fantasy. What we're exploring is the documented evidence that medieval physicians possessed knowledge we're only now beginning to appreciate again. These 12 remedies I'm going to share with you weren't chosen because they sound exotic or because they fit some anti-pharmaceutical narrative. They were selected because rigorous, peer-reviewed scientific studies have demonstrated their effectiveness, often superior to the synthetic drugs that replaced them. If you're wondering how we know these medieval remedies actually worked when medical texts from the period are filled with questionable advice, the answer lies in thousands of hours of unexpected detective work by modern researchers. In university laboratories from Oxford to Stanford, pharmacologists and medical historians have been systematically testing medieval prescriptions using 21st century technology. They've extracted compounds, run clinical trials, compared efficacy rates, and documented side effect profiles. What they've discovered has quietly revolutionized our understanding of medieval medical sophistication. These weren't ignorant people guessing in the dark. These were skilled practitioners working within sophisticated therapeutic systems that modern arrogance dismissed for centuries. Take something as simple as honey. You probably think of it as a sweet treat, something to drizzle on your morning oatmeal or stir into tea. Medieval physicians, however, used specific types of honey as a primary wound treatment, applying it directly to burns, ulcers, and infected injuries. They observed empirically that certain honeys prevented infection, promoted healing, and reduced scarring better than any other treatment available. Modern research has confirmed that medical-grade honey possesses antibacterial, antifungal, and anti-inflammatory properties that make it more effective than many synthetic wound dressings for certain types of injuries. In fact, hospitals today are increasingly using medical honey for wound care, not because it's trendy or natural, but because clinical trials have proven it works for infections that resist antibiotics. So why did honey as medicine disappear from standard medical practice for several hundred years? The answer has more to do with economics and professional politics than with scientific evidence. The same forces that sidelined honey also eliminated 11 other remarkably effective medieval remedies, creating gaps in our medical knowledge that we're still trying to fill today. The magnitude of what medieval physicians achieved becomes clear when you realize they did it all without microscopes, without chemical analysis, without randomized controlled trials. They worked instead through generations of careful observation, recording which treatments helped which conditions, refining their methods through a slow accumulation of clinical experience that spanned hundreds of years. When a particular herb worked for a particular patient's symptoms, they noted it. When a preparation method increased effectiveness or reduced side effects, they adjusted their techniques. When a combination of herbs proved synergistic, they preserved that knowledge in hand-copied manuscripts that were passed from master to apprentice, from monastery to university, across continents and languages. The tragedy isn't that medieval people had effective remedies. The tragedy is that we threw most of them away in our rush toward pharmaceutical modernity, dismissing centuries of accumulated wisdom as superstition without ever bothering to test most of it. We didn't evaluate these treatments on their merits. We simply declared them obsolete and moved on, creating a cultural amnesia about therapeutic approaches that might have saved millions of people needless suffering. Consider digitalis, a plant extract used by medieval European herbalists to treat dropsy, what we now call congestive heart failure. The foxglove plant, with its dramatic purple flowers, appears in herbals from the 10th century onward as a treatment for swelling and shortness of breath. 17th century physician William Withering famously documented its use by an old woman in Shropshire who had created a secret herbal mixture that successfully treated heart failure when standard medical approaches had failed. Withering spent years identifying foxglove as the active ingredient and perfecting the dosage. Today, digoxin, derived from foxglove, remains an important heart medication used worldwide. But here's what's fascinating: medieval herbalists achieved similar therapeutic success with crude extracts and careful dosing, despite having no understanding of cardiac glycosides or their mechanism of action. They simply observed that it worked and developed sophisticated methods for using it safely. The story of Digitalis illustrates a fundamental truth about medieval medicine that modern scholarship has only recently acknowledged. These practitioners were far more sophisticated than we ever gave them credit for. They might not have understood molecular mechanisms, but they understood human physiology through careful, systematic observation. They recognized the connection between heart function and fluid retention. They observed that foxglove could strengthen the heartbeat while increasing urine production. They learned through bitter experience that too much foxglove was deadly, and they developed methods for preparing it that maximized therapeutic benefit while minimizing toxicity. What makes their achievement even more remarkable is how they worked within comprehensive medical frameworks that integrated diet, lifestyle, herbal treatment, and what we would now call mind-body medicine. A medieval physician treating heart failure didn't simply prescribe foxglove. They also adjusted the patient's diet to reduce salt, recommended specific exercises appropriate for the patient's condition, used other herbs to support kidney function, and addressed the patient's emotional and spiritual state. This holistic approach, dismissed as unscientific for centuries, is now recognized by modern integrative medicine as often producing better outcomes than single drug interventions. The more I've researched medieval medicine, the more I've realized how much effective knowledge was systematically discarded. It wasn't just a few remedies that worked. Entire therapeutic systems that had proven their effectiveness over hundreds of years were declared obsolete almost overnight. The reasons ranged from legitimate safety concerns about variable potency and contamination to professional turf wars between emerging scientific medicine and traditional healers, to economic pressures from the growing pharmaceutical industry, to simple cultural arrogance about anything that didn't fit the emerging biomedical model. What gets lost in this story is the human cost. When these 12 remedies, and hundreds of others like them, were eliminated from the medical toolkit, real patients suffered needlessly. People with chronic pain who might have responded beautifully to willow bark and other natural anti-inflammatories instead lived with agony or became addicted to opiates. People with depression who might have found relief in St. John's wort and supportive therapy instead languished with ineffective treatments or dangerous pharmaceutical side effects. People with wounds that resisted conventional treatment might have healed with honey or maggots, but these options were literally laughed out of medical practice for generations. The irony is that modern medicine is now quietly returning to many of these medieval approaches, often without acknowledging the historical precedent. Leeches, once dismissed as medieval barbarism, are now FDA-approved medical devices used in microsurgery and for certain circulatory conditions. Maggots are licensed for wound debridement in hospitals worldwide. Honey is used in burn units and for difficult-to-treat ulcers. Silver is making a comeback for its antimicrobial properties. The list goes on and on. What I want to accomplish in this video is to give you the full picture, not just which medieval remedies worked, but why they worked, how they were used, and most importantly, why they disappeared. These 12 remedies represent something larger than themselves. They represent a lost continent of medical knowledge that we're only beginning to rediscover. They represent what happens when we let ideology, economics, and professional arrogance override accumulated human wisdom. We're going to start in medieval herb gardens, move through monastic infirmaries, visit the universities where physicians trained, explore the homes where ordinary people practiced domestic medicine, and finally arrive at modern laboratories where ancient remedies are receiving the scientific validation they were denied for centuries. We're going to meet the physicians, the monks, the herbalists, and the ordinary people whose careful observations created what amounted to the world's longest-running, largest-scale clinical trial. But before we explore the specific remedies, we need to understand something crucial about how medieval people thought about health and healing. They didn't separate the physical from the spiritual, the emotional from the physiological, the preventive from the curative, in the way we do today. This wasn't because they were less sophisticated than us. It was because they recognized connections that our fragmented, specialist-driven healthcare system has only recently begun to rediscover. When a medieval physician prescribed a remedy, they considered not just the disease but the whole person, their constitution, their lifestyle, their environment, their emotional state, even their astrological charts. Some of this might sound like superstition to modern ears, but much of it reflects a sophisticated understanding that health is multifactorial, that different people respond differently to the same treatment, and that the body's natural healing capacity can be supported or undermined by countless factors. This holistic perspective enabled medieval physicians to develop remarkably nuanced approaches to treatment. They understood that a remedy that worked for a robust young farmer might be too strong for a frail elderly monk. They knew that the same herb prepared in summer might have different properties than when prepared in winter. They recognized that administering a remedy at the right time of day, in the right way, with the right mindset, could dramatically affect its effectiveness. These insights, gathered over centuries of careful practice, created therapeutic systems of astonishing complexity and sophistication. You might be thinking that if these remedies were so effective, surely we would have heard about them before now. Surely modern medicine would have embraced them if they were truly superior to synthetic drugs. The answer to that reasonable question is at once simple and deeply disturbing. We didn't test them systematically until very recently, and when we finally did, the results often contradicted decades of medical dogma. The story of St. John's wort provides a perfect example. This yellow-flowered plant appears in medieval herbals as a treatment for what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, and nerve pain. German physicians in particular maintained this tradition through the centuries, using standardized extracts with consistent results. When modern pharmacology decided to test St. John's wort in rigorous clinical trials, the results were unequivocal. For mild to moderate depression, St. John's wort proved as effective as synthetic antidepressants like Prozac and Zoloft, but with significantly fewer side effects. Subsequent research has identified multiple active compounds that work through several different mechanisms simultaneously. Exactly the kind of multi-target approach that modern drug development is beginning to emulate. But here's the catch. Most American physicians were taught for decades that St. John's wort was dangerous nonsense, and many still haven't updated their knowledge despite overwhelming evidence. Patients who've found relief using this medieval remedy often hesitate to mention it to their doctors, fearing ridicule or dismissal. The medieval treatment works, the science confirms it works, but the medical establishment remains stubbornly resistant. This resistance becomes even more baffling when you consider the terrible track record of many modern pharmaceuticals. Every year, prescription drugs kill thousands of Americans through adverse reactions, interactions, and complications. Many widely prescribed medications have been pulled from the market after causing severe harm. Yet somehow, medieval remedies that have been used safely for centuries remain viewed with suspicion, subjected to regulatory hurdles that synthetic drugs somehow overcome much more easily. I don't want to give you the impression that all medieval remedies were safe and effective, or that every medieval physician was a wise healer with perfect knowledge. The Middle Ages had their share of dangerous quackery, just as we do today. The point isn't that medieval medicine was perfect, far from it. The point is that embedded within imperfect medical systems were genuinely effective therapeutic approaches that we threw out without proper evaluation, and that modern science is now rediscovering. What makes this rediscovery so urgent now is that we're facing challenges medieval physicians never imagined. Antibiotic resistance is making common infections deadly again. Chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and depression are reaching epidemic proportions, often in patients taking multiple expensive medications with serious side effects. Healthcare costs are bankrupting families and straining entire economies. In this context, safe, effective, affordable treatments from the medieval toolkit deserve serious consideration. The 12 remedies we're going to explore in detail represent different aspects of this lost medical wisdom. Some are plants whose active compounds have been isolated and synthesized. Some are complete herbal formulations that work better than their isolated components. Some involve techniques rather than substances. Some have already been rehabilitated by modern medicine, while others remain stubbornly outside the mainstream despite compelling evidence. As we explore each remedy, I'll give you the historical context, how it was discovered, how it was used, what medieval physicians observed about its effects. I'll share the modern scientific evidence that validates or clarifies these traditional uses, explaining the biochemical mechanisms in plain language. And I'll examine why each remedy was abandoned, banned, or simply forgotten, revealing patterns that tell us as much about modern medicine as they do about medieval practices. We're going to see how medieval physicians achieved remarkable results with natural antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, antidepressants, wound treatments, and cardiovascular medications. We're going to discover preparation methods that preserved active compounds and maximized therapeutic benefits. We're going to encounter sophisticated understanding of drug interactions, dosage protocols, and individual variation in treatment response. In short, we're going to witness a level of medical sophistication that will surprise you. I also want to be realistic about what medieval medicine couldn't do. These physicians couldn't perform open heart surgery, they couldn't treat childhood leukemia, they couldn't prevent or cure most infectious diseases before the advent of vaccines. But within their limitations, they achieved remarkable success, and some of their therapeutic achievements remain impressive even by modern standards. What excites me most about this research isn't just the validation of medieval wisdom, but the potential for improving modern healthcare by integrating ancient and modern approaches. The future of medicine doesn't have to be a choice between medieval herbs and synthetic drugs. The most promising developments are happening at the intersection of both worlds, using modern science to understand, standardize, and optimize traditional remedies while maintaining the holistic perspective that made them effective for centuries. By the time we finish tonight's journey, you'll have a very different view of medieval medicine, and perhaps of modern medicine as well. You'll understand why these 12 remedies worked when they worked, why they disappeared when they disappeared, and why some of them are making a comeback despite ongoing resistance from the medical establishment. More importantly, you'll have a framework for evaluating traditional remedies that separates genuine therapeutic wisdom from romantic nonsense. So settle in. We're about to explore nearly 1,000 years of medical history, from monastery gardens to modern laboratories, from empirical observation to molecular biology, from forgotten knowledge to its surprising validation. The journey might stretch your assumptions about both past and present medicine, and you might find yourself wondering how much other valuable knowledge we've discarded in our rush toward modernity. The first remedy that demands our attention grows on a modest tree found throughout Europe and Asia. A tree that medieval physicians knew could ease pain and reduce fever with remarkable consistency. The willow tree, with its slender leaves and graceful branches, provided one of the most important drugs in medieval medicine, and continues to provide one of the most widely used medications in the modern world. But here's what your doctor probably never told you. The medieval version worked better for many conditions than the synthetic aspirin you buy today, and it caused fewer side effects. Medieval herbals describe willow bark preparations in detail that suggests centuries of careful refinement. Physicians like Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century wrote extensively about preparing willow bark tea for joint pain, headaches, and fever. But the knowledge goes back much further. Ancient Egyptian papyri from 1500 BCE describe willow preparations, and Hippocrates in the 5th century BCE recommended willow bark for pain relief. What makes the medieval approach different isn't that they discovered willow bark's effect, but that they developed sophisticated methods for using it safely and effectively. What medieval physicians couldn't know was that willow bark contains salicin, a compound that the human liver converts to salicylic acid, essentially the same active ingredient as modern aspirin. The difference lies in how this compound is delivered. When you take aspirin, you get a concentrated dose of pure acetylsalicylic acid that hits your system all at once. This provides fast relief, but it can also cause stomach irritation, bleeding, and other complications from the rapid absorption and high local concentration in your digestive tract. The medieval approach was gentler but no less effective. Physicians prepared willow bark by boiling it slowly in wine or water, sometimes adding honey or other herbs to improve the taste and potentially enhance the therapeutic effect. This slow preparation released salicin along with dozens of other compounds including flavonoids, tannins, and antioxidants that modern research suggests may have synergistic effects. The result was what we would now recognize as a time-release medication that provided sustained pain relief without the digestive upset. Modern pharmaceutical companies eventually developed enteric-coated aspirin to address the stomach irritation problem. but they never successfully recreated the cocktail of protective compounds found in whole willow bark. Studies have shown that people who take willow bark extract experience pain relief comparable to aspirin, but with significantly lower rates of stomach irritation and bleeding. The natural form somehow protects the digestive tract while delivering effective levels of pain relief, a characteristic that makes it superior for long-term use in chronic conditions like arthritis. But willow bark represented something even more profound in medieval medicine. It was part of sophisticated understanding about dosage, timing, and individual variation in treatment response. Medieval physicians observed that not everyone responded to willow bark in the same way, and they developed methods for adjusting preparation and dosage based on the patient's constitution, the severity of symptoms, and the season. They noticed that willow bark gathered in spring seemed more potent than bark gathered in autumn, and they adjusted their preparations accordingly. They recognized that willow bark could cause stomach upset in some patients, and they developed methods for preparing it with stomach protective herbs like marshmallow root or licorice. Interestingly, medieval physicians also used willow bark preventively. Records from monastic infirmaries show that during fever seasons, monks would receive small daily doses of willow bark tea to prevent rather than treat fever. This preventive approach, largely abandoned in modern medicine in favor of treating established symptoms, reflects sophisticated understanding of disease progression and the body's response mechanisms. Modern research has validated this approach. Low-dose aspirin is now standard preventive treatment for heart attack and stroke risk, exactly the kind of preventive use that medieval physicians pioneered. The disappearance of willow bark from mainstream medicine had little to do with effectiveness and everything to do with standardization and profit. In the late 19th century, Bayer developed synthetic aspirin that could be manufactured consistently, sold globally, and patented for maximum profit. The company aggressively marketed aspirin as superior to natural willow bark, emphasizing its standardized purity while downplaying its side effects. Natural willow bark couldn't be patented, couldn't be standardized as easily, and couldn't generate the same profit margins. Within a few decades, one of humanity's most important medicines had been largely forgotten. Today, willow bark extract is making a cautious comeback as people seek gentler alternatives to synthetic pain medications, but it remains outside mainstream medical practice. Most physicians have never prescribed it, most pharmacists don't stock it, and most patients have never heard of it as a legitimate medical treatment. The medieval remedy that worked effectively for over 2 millennia has been relegated to the status of alternative medicine, despite clear evidence of its effectiveness and safety profile. The second remedy on our list grows in sunny meadows across Europe, a bright yellow flower that medieval physicians called hypericum but we know as St. John's wort. Unlike willow bark, which primarily treated physical pain, St. John's wort addressed mental and emotional suffering, specifically the depression, anxiety, and nerve pain that medieval physicians recognized as related conditions requiring a gentle, systemic approach. Medieval herbals described St. John's wort extensively, but with intriguing sophistication that suggests they understood its effects on mood and nervous system function far better than we initially assumed. Physicians prescribed it for what they called melancholy, a condition they described in terms that modern psychiatrists would immediately recognize as depression. Patients were noted to lose pleasure in activities they once enjoyed, to sleep excessively or not enough, to experience changes in appetite and energy, to withdraw from social interaction, and to describe feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. The medieval treatment approach involved St. John's wort combined with dietary changes, increased sunlight exposure, gentle exercise, and what amounts to early cognitive behavioral therapy. What medieval physicians observed empirically, and what modern science has confirmed through dozens of clinical trials, is that St. John's wort is remarkably effective for mild to moderate depression. Multiple meta-analyses combining data from thousands of patients have shown that standardized St. John's wort extract is as effective as prescription antidepressants like Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil, but with significantly fewer side effects. Patients using St. John's wort report less sexual dysfunction, less weight gain, less emotional numbing, and fewer withdrawal symptoms when discontinuing treatment. The biochemical mechanism is both fascinating and complex, which helps explain why it took modern science so long to understand how St. John's wort works. Unlike synthetic antidepressants that typically target a single neurotransmitter system, St. John's wort contains multiple active compounds that work through several different mechanisms simultaneously. Hypericin and hyperforin, the two most studied compounds, affect serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine systems while also exerting anti-inflammatory effects and promoting nerve growth factor production. This multi-target approach appears to provide more balanced mood regulation with fewer side effects than single-mechanism drugs. Medieval preparation methods for St. John's wort were remarkably sophisticated. Physicians prepared it as a tea, but also as an oil infusion for external use in nerve pain and wound healing. They observed that the herb worked best when gathered at specific times, typically around the summer solstice when the flowers were newly opened and the hypericin content was highest. They noted that different preparations seemed to work better for different conditions, with stronger alcohol extracts used for severe melancholy and gentler water infusions for milder mood disturbances. What medieval physicians couldn't know, but what modern neurochemistry has revealed, is that St. John's wort also has anti-inflammatory effects in the brain that may contribute to its antidepressant properties. Growing evidence suggests that depression involves brain inflammation, and St. John's wort's ability to reduce inflammatory markers may be part of why it works so effectively for some patients who don't respond to conventional antidepressants. The suppression of St. John's wort followed a familiar pattern. When pharmaceutical antidepressants were developed in the mid-20th century, they were aggressively marketed as scientifically superior to herbal treatments. Natural St. John's wort couldn't be patented, couldn't be prescribed for maximum profit, and didn't fit the emerging biomedical model of mental health treatment. Physicians were taught that depression was a chemical imbalance requiring pharmaceutical correction, not a condition that could respond to natural interventions. The pharmaceutical industry also funded studies that emphasized St. John's wort's potential interaction with other medications while downplaying its effectiveness as a primary treatment. While the interaction concerns were legitimate, St. John's wort can affect liver enzymes that metabolize other drugs, This risk could be managed through proper medical supervision rather than outright abandonment of the treatment. The result was that generations of physicians were taught that St. John's wort was dangerous and ineffective despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Today, St. John's wort is used safely and effectively throughout much of Europe, particularly in Germany, where it's one of the most prescribed treatments for mild to moderate depression. In the United States, however, it remains largely outside mainstream medical practice, dismissed by many physicians despite overwhelming scientific evidence of its effectiveness. Patients who find relief with St. John's wort often have to choose between effective treatment and medical supervision, a false choice created by institutional resistance to traditional remedies. The third remedy brings us to one of the most beautiful and dangerous plants in medieval medicine, the foxglove, whose tall spikes of purple, pink, or white flowers contain compounds that can either save a failing heart or cause fatal arrhythmias. Medieval physicians managed to use this plant effectively for what they called dropsy, a condition characterized by severe swelling throughout the body that we now recognize as congestive heart failure. The sophistication of medieval foxglove use is breathtaking when you understand the narrow therapeutic window involved. The difference between a therapeutic dose and a toxic dose of digitalis compounds is remarkably small, yet medieval physicians developed methods for preparing and administering foxglove that achieved consistent positive results while minimizing risk. They recognized that foxglove strengthened the heartbeat while promoting fluid elimination through increased urine production, exactly the combination needed to treat heart failure. European herbalists as early as the 10th century described foxglove's use for dropsy, but the knowledge seems to have been refined over centuries through careful clinical observation. By the 12th century, physicians had developed sophisticated protocols for standardizing foxglove preparations, using leaves from specific parts of the plant gathered at specific times of year to maximize potency and consistency. They learned to dry and store the leaves carefully, to prepare tinctures and infusions of known strength, and to start with very small doses that could be gradually increased based on patient response. Medieval physicians also learned to recognize early warning signs of digitalis toxicity, nausea, visual disturbances, or regular pulse, and they developed specific antidotes including activated charcoal, vomiting induction, and supportive treatments. This level of sophistication in managing a potentially lethal medication demonstrates that medieval medicine was far more advanced than modern stereotypes suggest. The key innovation in medieval foxglove use was what we would now call therapeutic drug monitoring. Physicians observed each patient carefully, adjusted dosages based on response and side effects, and maintained detailed records that allowed them to refine their protocols over time. They recognized that some patients responded to foxglove while others didn't, that some could tolerate higher doses than others, and that the same patient might need different doses at different times depending on their overall condition. Modern digitalis preparations, derived from foxglove, remain important heart medications today. Digoxin is still prescribed for certain types of heart failure and atrial fibrillation, and it's considered an essential medication by the World Health Organization. But modern use has largely abandoned the nuanced, individualized approach that medieval physicians pioneered. Patients typically receive standardized doses based on population averages rather than careful titration based on individual response, potentially missing the optimal balance between effectiveness and safety that medieval physicians achieved. What makes medieval foxglove use even more impressive is that these physicians achieved good results without understanding cardiac physiology, without electrocardiograms to monitor heart rhythm, without blood tests to measure digitalis levels. They worked purely through careful observation of symptoms, pulse characteristics, urine output, and patient reports, a kind of clinical art that modern medicine has largely replaced with technology. The disappearance of sophisticated foxglove preparation methods followed the familiar pattern of pharmaceutical standardization. In the 20th century, purified digoxin became widely available as a standardized pharmaceutical product, and the complex, labor-intensive methods of medieval herbalists were abandoned in favor of the convenient pill. The problem is that standardized dosing doesn't account for individual variation in absorption, metabolism, and response to digitalis. Medieval physicians solved this problem through careful individual titration. Modern medicine solved it by accepting that some patients would be over-medicated and some under-medicated as long as most fell within the therapeutic window. Today, as pharmacogenomics reveals how individual genetic differences affect drug response, we're rediscovering the value of individualized dosing that medieval physicians practiced centuries ago. The future of digitalis and many other medications may well involve a return to the kind of careful patient-specific adjustment that medieval herbalists mastered. The fourth remedy brings us to the root of a plant that medieval physicians valued for its ability to calm anxiety, promote sleep, and soothe digestive disturbances: valerian, whose pungent root has been used as medicine for over 2,000 years. What makes valerian particularly interesting is that it demonstrates how medieval physicians developed sophisticated understanding of conditions that modern medicine only recently began to take seriously. Medieval herbals describe valerian root extensively for what physicians called nervous afflictions, conditions characterized by anxiety, restlessness, insomnia, muscle tension, and digestive complaints that often accompanied emotional distress. Physicians like the 12th century abbess Hildegard of Bingen wrote about using valerian to calm restless patients, promote sleep in those afflicted by troubled thoughts, and settle digestive complaints that seemed related to emotional upset. This recognition of mind-body connections and the role of stress in physical symptoms was remarkably sophisticated. Modern research has confirmed that valerian root is genuinely effective for anxiety and insomnia, often comparing favorably to benzodiazepine medications like Xanax or Valium, but with significantly fewer side effects and less risk of dependence. Clinical studies have shown that valerian improves sleep quality, reduces sleep latency, and decreases nighttime awakenings without causing morning grogginess or cognitive impairment. Patients using valerian for anxiety report reduced symptoms without the emotional blunting or memory problems associated with many anti-anxiety medications. The mechanism involves multiple compounds that work through the GABA system, the same neurotransmitter system that benzodiazepines target, but in a more balanced, gentle way. Valerianic acid and other active compounds in valerian appear to enhance GABA activity naturally, providing anxiety relief and sleep promotion without the tolerance and dependence issues associated with pharmaceutical benzodiazepines. Valerian also contains compounds that may have direct muscle relaxing effects, helping to explain its traditional use for muscle tension and restlessness. Medieval preparation methods for valerian were particularly sophisticated. Physicians recognized that fresh valerian root was less effective than properly cured root, and they developed elaborate methods for harvesting, drying, and storing valerian to maximize its medicinal properties. They prepared valerian as teas, tinctures, and even inhaled preparations, noting that different preparations seemed to work better for different conditions. Stronger alcohol-based tinctures were used for acute anxiety episodes, while gentler water infusions were preferred for ongoing sleep support. What medieval physicians also understood was the importance of treating the whole person rather than just the symptoms. When prescribing valerian for insomnia, they also addressed diet, exercise, stress management, and emotional concerns. When treating anxiety, they combined valerian with lifestyle modifications and what amounted to primitive psychotherapy. This holistic approach, dismissed as unscientific for decades, is now recognized as optimal treatment for anxiety and sleep disorders. The suppression of valerian followed the familiar pattern. Pharmaceutical companies developed synthetic sedatives and anti-anxiety medications that could be patented and sold at enormous profit margins. These drugs were marketed as more scientific and reliable than old-fashioned herbal remedies, despite growing evidence of serious side effects and dependence issues. Natural valerian couldn't compete financially with products like barbiturates and later benzodiazepines, even though it offered comparable effectiveness with better safety profiles for many patients. What makes valerian's disappearance particularly tragic is that anxiety disorders and insomnia have reached epidemic proportions in modern society, and the pharmaceutical treatments most widely prescribed carry significant risks of dependence, cognitive impairment, and difficult withdrawal. Many patients cycle through multiple medications seeking relief from anxiety and insomnia, experiencing significant side effects while remaining unaware that safe, effective herbal alternatives exist. Today, valerian is widely available as a dietary supplement, but it remains outside mainstream medical practice. Most physicians have little training in herbal medicine and may be unaware of the substantial research supporting valerian's effectiveness. Patients who discover valerian on their own often use it without medical guidance, potentially missing opportunities to address underlying causes of their anxiety or insomnia. The fifth remedy brings us to combinations that medieval physicians created using ingredients so ordinary you probably have them in your kitchen right now: garlic and honey, combined in preparations that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of infection control, wound healing, and immune system support. Medieval herbals described garlic and honey preparations with remarkable specificity that suggests careful clinical observation over many generations. Physicians prescribed these combinations for respiratory infections, digestive complaints, wound infections, and as general tonics during illness or recovery from injury. What medieval physicians observed empirically, And what modern research has systematically confirmed is that garlic and honey together create a synergistic antimicrobial effect that exceeds the sum of their individual benefits. Garlic contains allicin and other sulfur compounds that have broad-spectrum antibacterial, antifungal, and antiviral properties. Honey contains hydrogen peroxide, glucose oxidase, and other antimicrobial compounds that create an environment hostile to pathogens while promoting tissue repair and reducing inflammation. Together, they create a treatment that kills pathogens, prevents infection, promotes healing, and supports immune function, exactly the kind of multi-target approach that modern medicine is beginning to recognize as optimal for treating infections. Modern laboratory studies have confirmed that garlic and honey combinations are effective against dozens of bacterial strains, including some antibiotic-resistant pathogens. The combination appears to work through multiple mechanisms simultaneously, disrupting bacterial cell walls, interfering with pathogen metabolism, and supporting human immune function, which may help explain why resistance doesn't develop as easily as with single-mechanism antibiotics. Medieval preparation methods were sophisticated and consistent. Physicians typically crushed fresh garlic and mixed it with raw honey, allowing the mixture to stand for a specific period before use. They recognized that garlic's antimicrobial properties were most potent when consumed fresh rather than cooked, and they used honey from specific sources known to have particular therapeutic qualities. Records suggest that honey from certain regions or seasonal collections was preferred for medicinal use, suggesting that medieval physicians understood that honey quality varied in ways that affected therapeutic effectiveness. What medieval physicians also understood was dose-response relationships and the importance of timing. Garlic and honey preparations were administered in specific quantities at specific intervals, with adjustments made based on patient response. Physicians recognized that larger doses were needed for active infections than for preventive use, and that some patients tolerated garlic better than others. They developed methods for preparing garlic to minimize digestive upset while maximizing therapeutic benefit, often combining it with other herbs that protected the stomach. The beauty of garlic and honey as medieval medicine is that it was accessible to everyone. Poor peasants and wealthy nobles alike could prepare these combinations using locally available ingredients. This democratized medicine didn't depend on expensive imported ingredients or specialized knowledge, making effective treatment available across all social classes. Medieval physicians seem to have recognized that widespread availability was a feature, not a bug, and they documented these simple preparations as thoroughly as they documented more exotic remedies. The disappearance of garlic and honey as formal medical treatments had less to do with effectiveness than with professionalization and the emergence of pharmaceutical antibiotics. As scientific medicine developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, physicians sought to distinguish themselves from traditional healers and folk medicine practitioners. Simple, accessible remedies like garlic and honey didn't fit the increasingly complex, technology-dependent model of modern medicine, nor did they generate the profit margins necessary to support pharmaceutical companies. Physicians were taught that serious infections required prescription antibiotics, not kitchen remedies, despite evidence that garlic and honey were effective for many common infections. The medical establishment embraced the idea that scientific medicine meant synthetic drugs produced by pharmaceutical companies, and traditional remedies were dismissed as superstition regardless of their demonstrated effectiveness. Today, as antibiotic resistance becomes a global crisis, medical researchers are returning to garlic and honey with renewed interest. Studies are exploring garlic extracts as potential treatments for drug-resistant infections, and medical-grade honey is increasingly used in wound care and burn treatment. The medieval combination of garlic and honey may yet have a role in modern medicine as we search for alternatives to failing antibiotics. The sixth remedy takes us to a common meadow plant that medieval physicians valued for its remarkable ability to stop bleeding, promote wound healing, and reduce inflammation: yarrow, whose feathery leaves and clusters of white or pink flowers contain compounds that make it one of nature's most effective first aid treatments. Medieval herbals describe yarrow as a virtual panacea for wounds and bleeding, recommended for everything from battlefield injuries to nosebleeds to surgical wounds. Physicians like the 1st century Greek physician Dioscorides wrote extensively about yarrow's ability to stop bleeding quickly and promote clean healing, and this knowledge was preserved and refined throughout the medieval period. What made yarrow particularly valuable was its widespread availability and the speed with which it worked. It could be applied directly to fresh wounds to control bleeding within seconds. Modern research has confirmed that yarrow contains multiple compounds that explain its traditional uses. Achillein, a compound named after the mythical warrior Achilles who was said to have used yarrow on the battlefield, has documented hemostatic properties that can stop bleeding rapidly. Yarrow also contains anti-inflammatory compounds, antimicrobial agents, and compounds that promote tissue regeneration and reduce scarring. Clinical studies have shown that yarrow preparations can reduce bleeding time by 50 to 70%, making it clinically significant for wound management. The plant's anti-inflammatory effects help reduce pain and swelling, while its antimicrobial properties help prevent infection. Yarrow extracts have been shown to be effective against multiple bacterial strains including antibiotic-resistant pathogens, making it particularly valuable for wound care in situations where infection risk is high. Medieval preparation methods for yarrow were sophisticated and context-specific. For immediate bleeding control, fresh yarrow leaves were crushed and applied directly to wounds. For longer-term wound care, physicians prepared yarrow as ointments, oils, and tinctures that could be stored and used as needed. They also used yarrow internally as a tea for internal bleeding, heavy menstrual flow, and inflammatory conditions, recognizing that the same plant could address both external and internal bleeding through different preparation methods. What medieval physicians also understood was yarrow's role in preventing complications from wounds. They observed that wounds treated with yarrow were less likely to become infected, healed more quickly, and resulted in less scarring than wounds treated with other methods. This observation has been validated by modern research showing that yarrow promotes healthy granulation tissue formation and reduces excessive scar tissue formation. The versatility of yarrow extended beyond wound care. Medieval physicians used it for digestive complaints, recognizing that the same anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties that made it effective for wounds also made it useful for treating gastrointestinal inflammation and infection. They prescribed yarrow tea for fever, menstrual cramps, urinary tract infections, and respiratory conditions, essentially recognizing that inflammation and infection manifested differently in different body systems but could often be addressed with the same gentle anti-inflammatory antimicrobial treatment. Medieval military medicine made extensive use of yarrow, with soldiers carrying dried yarrow into battle for immediate wound treatment. Historical accounts suggest that yarrow was standard issue for many medieval armies, and that its use significantly reduced mortality from battlefield wounds. The plant's ability to stop bleeding quickly and prevent infection made the difference between life and death for countless soldiers, a fact that physicians documented carefully and passed on through generations of military medical training. The disappearance of yarrow from mainstream medicine happened gradually as modern pharmaceuticals replaced traditional remedies. Styptic pencils and chemical hemostatic agents replaced yarrow for bleeding control, while synthetic antibiotics replaced natural antimicrobial treatments. As with other traditional remedies, yarrow couldn't compete economically with patentable synthetic drugs, nor did it fit the emerging model of scientific medicine. Today, yarrow is experiencing something of a revival among people interested in natural health and emergency preparedness. Wilderness medicine experts recommend yarrow as a natural first aid treatment, and research continues into its applications in modern wound care. But it remains largely unknown to mainstream physicians and absent from most medical training programs, despite its proven effectiveness and safety. What makes yarrow particularly valuable in the modern context is its potential role in addressing antibiotic resistance. As more pathogens become resistant to conventional antibiotics, natural antimicrobial agents like yarrow may provide alternative or adjunctive treatments for wound infections. The medieval approach of using whole plant preparations that contain multiple active compounds may prove particularly valuable in preventing resistance, since pathogens are less likely to develop resistance to multiple mechanisms simultaneously. As we reach the end of our exploration of these 6 botanical remedies, a pattern emerges that challenges our assumptions about medical progress. Medieval physicians achieved remarkable therapeutic success using plants, observation, and careful clinical practice. They understood dose-response relationships, individual variation in treatment response, preventive medicine, and the importance of treating the whole person rather than isolated symptoms. They developed sophisticated preparation methods that maximized therapeutic benefits while minimizing side effects, often achieving results that compare favorably with modern pharmaceuticals. The disappearance of these remedies had more to do with economics, professional politics, and cultural assumptions about scientific progress than with demonstrated superiority of synthetic alternatives. As we'll see in our next section, the same pattern repeats with non-botanical remedies that medieval physicians used with equal sophistication and effectiveness. The medieval physician's toolkit extended far beyond the plant kingdom into remedies that seem almost magical in their effectiveness. Honey that could heal wounds resistant to modern antibiotics. silver that killed infection before the discovery of bacteria, leeches that provided life-saving therapy for conditions that still challenge surgeons today. These 7 non-botanical remedies demonstrate that medieval medicine achieved therapeutic sophistication across multiple domains, developing techniques and substances that modern medicine is still struggling to improve upon. The 7th remedy on our list takes us to the beehive, but not for the honey you drizzle on your morning toast. Medieval physicians used specific types of honey as primary wound treatments, creating preparations that modern research has shown to be more effective than many synthetic wound dressings for certain types of infections. What they couldn't have known was that they were harnessing dozens of antimicrobial compounds, enzymes, and healing factors that work in concert to create one of nature's most sophisticated wound healing agents. Medieval herbals and surgical texts describe honey preparations with remarkable specificity that suggests centuries of careful clinical observation. Physicians distinguished between different types of honey based on their source, season of collection, and therapeutic properties, recognizing that honey from certain flowers or regions possessed superior healing qualities for specific types of wounds. Dark honeys from sources like buckwheat were preferred for infected wounds and ulcers, while lighter honeys were used for burns and superficial injuries. Physicians observed that honey prevented infection, promoted tissue regeneration, reduced inflammation, and minimized scarring better than any other treatment available. What made medieval honey formulations particularly sophisticated was how physicians prepared and applied them. Raw honey was recognized as superior to heated or processed honey, and physicians developed methods for collecting and storing honey that preserved its enzymatic activity and antimicrobial properties. Some preparations involved mixing honey with herbs, oils, or wine to create wound dressings tailored to specific types of injuries. More viscous preparations for deep wounds, lighter preparations for burns, and so on. Physicians also recognized that honey worked best when wounds were properly cleaned first, when dressings were changed regularly, and when honey was applied in sufficient quantity to maintain continuous contact with wound surfaces. Modern research has systematically validated what medieval physicians observed empirically. Medical-grade honey has been shown to be effective against dozens of bacterial species, including antibiotic-resistant strains like MRSA. The mechanisms are multiple and elegant. Honey's high sugar content creates an osmotic environment that draws fluid from bacterial cells while depriving pathogens of the water they need to multiply. Honey also contains hydrogen peroxide, generated by the enzyme glucose oxidase, which provides broad-spectrum antimicrobial activity. Additionally, honey contains antimicrobial peptides, phenolic compounds, and other factors that disrupt bacterial biofilms and prevent infections from establishing themselves in wounds. What makes honey particularly remarkable as a wound treatment is that it not only kills pathogens but actively promotes healing through multiple mechanisms. Honey stimulates tissue regeneration, reduces inflammation, and creates a protective barrier that keeps wounds moist while allowing oxygen exchange, exactly the environment that promotes optimal healing. Clinical trials have shown that honey dressings can heal chronic wounds that have resisted conventional treatment for months or years, often achieving complete healing where other approaches have failed. Medieval physicians also used honey internally for respiratory infections, digestive complaints, and as a general health tonic. They observed that honey seemed to soothe coughs, improve digestive function, and promote recovery from illness. Observations that modern research has validated through studies showing honey's antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, and immune-supporting properties. Honey's effectiveness for cough suppression, particularly in children, has been demonstrated in multiple clinical trials, often comparing favorably to over-the-counter cough medications while avoiding their side effects. The suppression of honey as medicine followed a familiar pattern. As pharmaceutical antibiotics became available in the mid-20th century, honey was dismissed as old-fashioned folk remedy despite its proven effectiveness. The medical establishment embraced the idea that scientific medicine meant synthetic drugs, and natural treatments like honey were relegated to alternative medicine regardless of their clinical benefits. Honey couldn't be patented, couldn't be standardized in ways that maximized profit margins, and didn't require the sophisticated manufacturing and distribution networks that supported the pharmaceutical industry. Today, medical-grade honey is making a comeback in hospitals and wound care centers, but it remains outside mainstream medical practice for the most part. Many physicians remain unaware of the substantial research supporting honey's effectiveness, and patients with chronic wounds often suffer needlessly while potentially effective treatments remain unexplored. The medieval understanding that different types of honey possess different therapeutic properties has been largely lost, with modern medical honey typically being standardized rather than matched to specific wound types as medieval physicians would have done. The eighth remedy brings us to what might be the most surprising medieval medical innovation: silver as antimicrobial treatment. Long before germ theory, medieval physicians somehow understood that silver prevented infection, promoted healing, and could be used to treat conditions ranging from wound infections to water purification. What makes this particularly fascinating is that medieval silver use has been validated by modern science in ways that reveal extraordinary prescience in medieval medical practice. Medieval surgeons used silver in multiple forms that modern research has shown to be effective against microbial pathogens. Silver sutures were used in surgical wounds where infection risk was high, and physicians observed that wounds closed with silver thread were significantly less likely to become infected than wounds closed with other materials. Silver foil was applied to burns and ulcers to prevent infection and promote healing. Silver containers were used to store water and other liquids that needed to remain pure, with physicians recognizing that water stored in silver vessels remained fresh longer and was less likely to cause illness. The sophistication of medieval silver use becomes apparent when you realize that these physicians developed detailed protocols for different silver preparations. They distinguished between silver from different sources, recognizing that silver from certain mines possessed superior antimicrobial properties. They understood that silver worked better in some forms than others: silver leaf for surface wounds, silver powder for deeper infections, silver solutions for internal use. They also recognized the importance of dose-response relationships, noting that too little silver was ineffective while too much could be toxic. What medieval physicians couldn't know, but what modern science has elucidated, is that silver ions disrupt multiple bacterial functions simultaneously. Silver interferes with bacterial DNA replication, protein synthesis, and cell membrane function while also disrupting bacterial enzyme systems. This multi-target mechanism makes it extremely difficult for bacteria to develop resistance, a property that makes silver particularly valuable in the age of antibiotic resistance. Modern research has confirmed that silver is effective against antibiotic-resistant pathogens including MRSA, VRE, and other multidrug-resistant organisms. Medieval physicians also seemed to understand silver's role in promoting wound healing beyond its antimicrobial effects. They observed that wounds treated with silver healed more quickly and with better cosmetic results than wounds treated with other methods, and they used silver preventively in high-risk situations. Burn victims, surgical patients, and people with chronic ulcers all received silver treatments as standard preventive care, an approach that modern medicine is only now beginning to embrace after decades of resistance. The disappearance of silver from mainstream medical practice is one of the more puzzling episodes in medical history. Silver was widely used and respected as an antimicrobial treatment through the 19th century, but as pharmaceutical antibiotics became available in the mid-20th century, silver was largely abandoned despite proven effectiveness. The medical establishment embraced antibiotics as more scientific and modern, dismissing silver as outdated even in situations where it remained superior. Only in recent decades has silver begun its return to medical practice, driven largely by the crisis of antibiotic resistance. Silver dressings are now used in hospitals for burns, chronic wounds, and surgical sites at high risk for infection. Silver-coated medical devices help prevent device-related infections. Silver solutions are used in some hospitals for water purification and surface disinfection. Medieval physicians would recognize most of these applications immediately, even if they might be surprised that it took modern medicine so long to rediscover what they knew centuries ago. What makes medieval silver use particularly remarkable is that it was safe and effective without understanding the mechanism. Modern medicine demands mechanism-based explanations before embracing treatments, but medieval physicians were content to use what worked even when they couldn't explain why it worked. This empirical approach, dismissed as unscientific for generations, turns out to have identified effective treatments that modern science has only recently begun to understand. The ninth remedy might seem like medieval barbarism to modern sensibilities. Leeches. Those blood-sucking creatures that most people find repulsive but that medieval physicians used with remarkable sophistication for conditions that still challenge modern medicine. What medieval physicians understood, and what modern medicine has been forced to relearn, is that leeches provide a unique combination of mechanical and biochemical effects that cannot be replicated by any synthetic treatment. Medieval surgical texts describe leech use in detail that reveals sophisticated understanding of circulatory disorders, inflammation, and wound healing. Physicians used leeches to treat localized swelling, inflammation, and blood congestion in ways that modern research has validated as mechanically and therapeutically sound. Leeches were applied to specific sites with precision that suggests careful anatomical understanding, and physicians developed protocols for how many leeches to use. how long to leave them attached, and how to care for the wound site afterward. The mechanical effects of leeches are straightforward. They remove blood from congested areas, reducing pressure and promoting circulation. But medieval physicians also seemed to understand that leeches provided therapeutic benefits beyond simple blood removal. They observed that leech bites continued to bleed for hours after the leeches were removed, suggesting that leeches injected something into the tissue that promoted continued drainage. They noted that areas treated with leeches had reduced swelling, improved circulation, and better healing outcomes than areas treated with other methods. Modern research has confirmed that leeches secrete dozens of bioactive compounds that provide therapeutic benefits far beyond simple blood removal. Hirudin, the most famous leech compound, is a potent anticoagulant that prevents blood clotting while the leech feeds and continues to work for hours after the leech is removed. Leeches also secrete compounds that reduce inflammation, dissolve blood clots, prevent infection, and promote tissue regeneration. This cocktail of bioactive compounds cannot be synthesized and delivered as effectively as leeches deliver it naturally. The sophistication of medieval leech therapy is particularly evident in how physicians managed the process to maximize benefits while minimizing risks. They recognized that leeches from different sources varied in effectiveness, and they developed methods for maintaining colonies of medicinal leeches with consistent therapeutic properties. They understood that leeches needed to be applied to specific anatomical sites to achieve desired therapeutic effects, and they developed protocols for patient preparation, leech application, and post-treatment care that minimized complications while maximizing therapeutic outcomes. Medieval physicians also seemed to understand when leech therapy was indicated and when it was contraindicated. They recognized that healthy patients could tolerate leech therapy better than debilitated patients, and they adjusted their treatment protocols accordingly. They understood that some conditions responded better to leeches than others. Localized swelling and blood congestion were primary indications, while systemic diseases were not. This clinical sophistication suggests careful observation and systematic refinement of practice over many generations. The suppression of leech therapy is one of the more dramatic examples of medical knowledge lost and rediscovered. As scientific medicine developed in the 19th century, leeches were dismissed as primitive and barbaric, symbols of everything that was wrong with medieval medicine. Physicians sought to distance themselves from traditional practices by emphasizing their scientific approach, and leeches became symbols of outdated medical thinking. The irony is that leeches never stopped working, they just became unfashionable. As surgeons became more skilled and medical technology advanced, leeches seemed increasingly primitive and unnecessary. Only in recent decades, as surgeons began performing microsurgical procedures like reattaching severed fingers and reconstructing damaged tissue, did they rediscover the unique therapeutic value of leeches. These delicate procedures often failed because blood could get into reattached tissue but couldn't get out, causing fatal congestion. Leeches provided the solution that no synthetic treatment could match. Today, leeches are FDA-approved medical devices used in hospitals worldwide for microsurgical procedures, circulatory disorders, and certain inflammatory conditions. Medical leeches are bred in sterile facilities, tested for pathogens, and shipped to hospitals where they're used in precisely the ways medieval physicians would recognize. Modern protocols for leech therapy closely resemble medieval descriptions, suggesting that medieval physicians achieved optimal therapeutic approaches through empirical observation and systematic refinement. The 10th remedy brings us to one of the most remarkable medical discoveries in medieval history: the observation that mold growing on bread, cheese, or other organic material could prevent wound infection and promote healing. What these medieval physicians discovered, centuries before Alexander Fleming's famous discovery of penicillin, was the antibiotic principle that would revolutionize 20th-century medicine. But medieval physicians didn't just observe this effect. They developed sophisticated methods for applying mold to wounds in ways that modern research has validated as therapeutically sound. Medieval surgical texts and herbals contain multiple references to using moldy bread, moldy cheese, or other moldy organic material as wound dressings. Physicians observed that wounds treated with certain types of mold were significantly less likely to become infected, and that established infections sometimes resolved when treated with mold preparations. The specificity of these descriptions suggests that physicians distinguished between different types of mold, recognizing that some were effective for wound treatment while others were not. What medieval physicians couldn't know, but what modern research has elucidated, is that certain molds produce antibacterial compounds that prevent or treat infection. Penicillium molds, the source of penicillin, grow naturally on bread, fruit, and cheese, and these molds produce penicillin and related compounds that are effective against many bacterial pathogens. Medieval physicians somehow identified particular types of mold that were therapeutically effective and developed methods for applying them to wounds in ways that delivered consistent antibiotic effects. The sophistication of medieval mold therapy is evident in how physicians prepared and applied these treatments. They didn't simply scrape mold from any available source and apply it to wounds. Instead, they developed methods for growing specific types of mold on suitable substrates, for identifying mold with therapeutic properties, for preparing mold in ways that maximized its effectiveness, and for applying it to wounds in appropriate quantities and frequencies. Some physicians maintained cultures of effective mold strains, transferring them from one substrate to another to ensure consistent therapeutic quality. Medieval physicians also seemed to understand that mold therapy worked better for some types of wounds than others. Fresh traumatic wounds, surgical incisions, and ulcers all received different mold preparations and protocols. They recognized that mold needed to remain in contact with wound surfaces to be effective, and they developed dressings that kept mold preparations in place while allowing air circulation. This level of sophistication suggests systematic experimentation and careful clinical observation over many generations. What makes medieval mold therapy particularly remarkable is that it represented a complete system of antibiotic treatment centuries before the germ theory of disease. These physicians couldn't see bacteria, couldn't culture pathogens, and couldn't perform sensitivity testing to determine which treatments would be effective against specific organisms. Yet through empirical observation, they identified effective antibiotic treatments and developed methods for using them safely and effectively. The disappearance of mold therapy is perhaps understandable given the circumstances of its rediscovery in the 20th century. When Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, it represented a scientific breakthrough that revolutionized medicine and saved millions of lives. The pharmaceutical industry developed methods for manufacturing pure penicillin and other antibiotics on an enormous scale, creating treatments that were standardized, potent, and could be prescribed and administered with precision. Medieval mold preparations couldn't compete with pure pharmaceutical antibiotics in terms of potency, standardization, or convenience. Mold therapy required careful preparation, couldn't be standardized easily, and carried some risk of contamination with undesirable organisms. From the perspective of mid-20th century medicine, purified antibiotics were clearly superior to medieval mold therapy, and there was no reason to preserve the old methods. Today, as antibiotic resistance becomes increasingly problematic, researchers are returning to natural antibiotic sources with renewed interest. Mold-derived antibiotics remain important, but researchers are also exploring other natural sources of antimicrobial compounds. The medieval approach of using whole mold preparations rather than isolated compounds might have advantages in preventing resistance, since whole preparations contain multiple antimicrobial compounds that work through different mechanisms. The 11th remedy brings us to another treatment that seems medieval in the most unflattering sense: maggot therapy. The use of sterile fly larvae to clean infected wounds by eating dead tissue while sparing healthy tissue. What sounds like torture or desperation was actually a sophisticated medical treatment that medieval physicians used with remarkable success, and that modern medicine has rediscovered as superior to surgical debridement for certain types of wounds. Medieval military surgeons particularly valued maggot therapy for treating battlefield wounds, and medical texts describe the technique in detail that reveals sophisticated understanding of wound healing and infection control. Physicians observed that wounds treated with maggots healed more quickly and completely than wounds treated with other methods, and they developed specific protocols for how to apply maggots, how many to use, how long to leave them in place, and how to care for the wound afterward. What medieval physicians couldn't know, but what modern research has elucidated, is that maggots provide multiple therapeutic benefits beyond simply removing dead tissue. Maggots secrete enzymes that break down dead tissue into liquid form that they can easily consume, and these enzymes also have antimicrobial properties that help control infection. Maggots also secrete compounds that promote tissue regeneration and reduce inflammation, creating an optimal environment for wound healing. The mechanical action of maggots crawling through wound tissue also stimulates blood flow and promotes healing in ways that cannot be replicated by any synthetic treatment. The sophistication of medieval maggot therapy is evident in several aspects of how physicians managed the treatment. They recognized that not all maggots were suitable for medical use. Certain species of flies produced maggots that were more effective and less likely to cause problems than others. They developed methods for obtaining clean maggots and maintaining them in ways that minimized contamination risk. They understood that maggots needed to be confined to wound areas where they were needed, and they developed dressings that kept maggots in place while allowing air circulation. Medieval physicians also seemed to understand when maggot therapy was indicated and when it was contraindicated. They used maggots primarily for wounds with significant amounts of dead or infected tissue that needed to be removed before healing could proceed. They avoided using maggots on wounds with exposed bone or major blood vessels, recognizing that maggots could cause problems in these situations. This clinical sophistication suggests careful observation and systematic refinement of technique over many years. The disappearance of maggot therapy is one of the more dramatic examples of medical knowledge abandoned and then rediscovered. As surgical techniques improved and antibiotics became available in the 20th century, maggot therapy was dismissed as primitive and unnecessary. The idea of intentionally placing fly larvae in wounds seemed barbaric and unscientific, and physicians were eager to distance themselves from such practices. The rediscovery of maggot therapy happened almost by accident in the late 20th century as surgeons encountered wounds that resisted all conventional treatments. Patients with chronic wounds, particularly diabetic foot ulcers and pressure sores, sometimes developed infections that antibiotics couldn't control and surgical debridement couldn't adequately address. In desperation, some physicians began experimenting with maggot therapy and discovered that it worked better than any available alternative. Today, medicinal maggots are FDA-approved medical devices produced in sterile facilities and shipped to hospitals worldwide for use in wound care. Modern protocols for maggot therapy closely resemble medieval descriptions, suggesting that medieval physicians achieved optimal therapeutic approaches that have proven difficult to improve upon. Medical maggots are used primarily for wounds with dead tissue that needs to be removed, particularly when other debridement methods have failed or are contraindicated. What makes maggot therapy particularly valuable in the modern context is its effectiveness against antibiotic-resistant infections. Maggots are effective against MRSA and other multi-drug-resistant pathogens, providing therapeutic options when antibiotics fail. The medieval approach of using living organisms to treat infection may prove increasingly valuable as antibiotic resistance continues to develop. The 12th and final remedy brings us to what might be the most sophisticated technology in medieval surgery: obsidian blades, sharper than the finest steel scalpels available today, used for procedures requiring precision that modern surgeons still struggle to achieve. What medieval physicians discovered, and what modern research has confirmed, is that obsidian blades produce cleaner cuts, cause less tissue damage, and promote better healing than steel surgical instruments. Obsidian, a naturally occurring volcanic glass, can be knapped to produce edges that are literally sharper than diamond. Edges so fine that they cut between individual cells rather than tearing through tissue like steel blades do. Medieval surgeons used obsidian blades for operations requiring extreme precision, eye surgery, delicate neurosurgery, and procedures where minimal tissue damage was critical for success. These blades provided surgical precision that wouldn't be matched until the development of laser surgery in the late 20th century. Stone Age people worldwide had used obsidian blades for thousands of years, but medieval surgeons refined obsidian technology to extraordinary levels. They developed methods for knapping obsidian to produce blades of specific shapes and sizes for different surgical procedures. They discovered ways to haft obsidian blades to handles that provided precise control during surgery. They learned which types of obsidian produced the sharpest, most durable blades, and they developed trade networks to obtain high-quality obsidian from sources across Europe and the Middle East. The sophistication of medieval obsidian surgery is particularly evident in ophthalmic procedures that medieval surgeons performed with success rates that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Surgeons used obsidian blades to remove cataracts, treat glaucoma, and perform delicate procedures on the eye that required sub-millimeter precision. They understood that obsidian caused less inflammation and scarring than metal instruments, and they developed protocols for using obsidian that maximized its advantages while minimizing its brittleness as a disadvantage. Archaeological evidence confirms that patients survived these procedures and healed successfully. Skulls from medieval surgical sites show bone healing around surgical cuts made with obsidian blades, demonstrating that patients lived for years after operations that we might assume were impossible without modern technology. Historical records describe successful eye surgeries, tumor removals, and other procedures that required the precision that only obsidian blades could provide. What medieval surgeons couldn't have known, but what modern materials science has elucidated, is why obsidian blades work so much better than steel for certain procedures. Obsidian blades produce cuts that are so clean and precise that they cause minimal cellular damage, triggering less inflammatory response and promoting better healing than steel blades. The molecular structure of obsidian creates edges that are smooth at the nanometer level, while even the finest steel blades have microscopic irregularities that damage tissue as they cut. The disappearance of obsidian blades from surgery is one of the more puzzling episodes in medical history. Steel became widely available and relatively inexpensive during the Middle Ages, and steel instruments could be manufactured more easily than obsidian blades. As surgery became more standardized and widespread, steel instruments became the norm simply because they were easier to produce in quantity. The unique advantages of obsidian blades were forgotten as surgery became more industrialized and less individualized. Only in recent decades have surgeons begun to rediscover obsidian's advantages for certain procedures. Some ophthalmic surgeons now use obsidian blades for procedures where minimal tissue damage is critical. Some dermatological procedures benefit from obsidian's precision, and some experimental surgical techniques are exploring obsidian's potential for procedures that still challenge modern surgical technology. What makes medieval obsidian surgery particularly remarkable is that it represented the peak of surgical technology for certain applications, technology that wouldn't be matched until the development of laser surgery centuries later. Yet this sophisticated technology was largely abandoned due to economic and practical considerations rather than therapeutic shortcomings. Steel instruments were good enough for most purposes, even if obsidian was superior for certain applications, and obsidian's advantages weren't sufficient to justify the extra effort required to produce obsidian blades. As we complete our exploration of these 7 non-botanical remedies, the pattern of lost and rediscovered medical knowledge becomes even more striking. Medieval physicians achieved therapeutic sophistication across an extraordinary range of treatments, from honey and silver that killed infection before antibiotics existed, to leeches and maggots that provided unique mechanisms for treating conditions that still challenge modern medicine, to mold-based antibiotics and obsidian surgical tools that wouldn't be matched for centuries. These remedies weren't accidents or lucky guesses. They represented systematic development of therapeutic approaches through careful observation, clinical experience, and transmission of knowledge across generations. They achieved results that modern medicine is still struggling to improve upon, and in some cases they provided therapeutic benefits that cannot be replicated by any synthetic treatment. The disappearance of these remedies had more to do with economics, professional politics, and cultural assumptions about progress than with demonstrated superiority of modern alternatives. As we'll explore in our next section, understanding why these effective treatments were abandoned reveals important truths about how medical knowledge develops, how it gets lost, and how it might be preserved or recovered. Understanding why 12 remarkably effective medieval remedies disappeared from medical practice reveals a complex story of economic interests, professional politics, cultural assumptions about scientific progress, and legitimate safety concerns mixed with manufactured controversies. The disappearance of these treatments wasn't accidental or inevitable. It was the result of specific historical forces that systematically eliminated competition to emerging pharmaceutical medicine while creating regulatory and cultural barriers that persist today. The early 20th century witnessed a fundamental transformation in how medicine was practiced, regulated, and funded throughout the Western world. What emerged was a new model of scientific medicine that explicitly rejected traditional remedies as unscientific superstition while embracing synthetic pharmaceuticals as the only legitimate approach to healing. This transformation was driven by powerful economic interests, professional organizations seeking to establish medical authority, and cultural assumptions about progress that equated scientific with synthetic and traditional with primitive. The pharmaceutical industry's rise fundamentally changed the economics of medicine in ways that made traditional remedies non-viable. Pharmaceutical companies discovered that synthetic drugs could be patented, giving them exclusive rights to manufacture and sell these products for years. This patent protection created enormous profit margins that funded research, marketing, and political influence. Natural remedies couldn't be patented. Willow bark, St. John's wort, garlic, honey, and foxglove belonged to everyone and no one. Without patent protection, there was no economic incentive to fund research, develop standardized preparations, or market these treatments to physicians and patients. This economic reality created a powerful bias throughout the emerging medical-industrial complex. Medical schools received funding from pharmaceutical companies for research and education, creating institutional dependence that shaped how medicine was taught. Physicians learned about pharmacology from textbooks and professors funded by companies that manufactured synthetic drugs, not from herbalists or traditional healers who used natural remedies. The entire educational and professional infrastructure of medicine developed around synthetic pharmaceuticals as the default standard of care. The transformation wasn't merely economic, it was cultural and professional as well. Physicians in the early 20th century were struggling to establish medicine as a respected profession with scientific authority. Traditional healers, herbalists, and natural practitioners represented competition for patients and professional legitimacy. Scientific medicine needed to distinguish itself from traditional practices, and the easiest way to do so was to declare traditional remedies unscientific while embracing synthetic drugs as uniquely modern and scientific. This professional competition was particularly intense in the United States, where medical practice was still relatively unregulated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The American Medical Association and other professional organizations fought for licensing laws that would eliminate competition from traditional practitioners while establishing allopathic medicine as the only legitimate approach to healthcare. These efforts were successful, and by the mid-20th century, most traditional healing practices had been criminalized or marginalized throughout the medical system. The Flexner Report of 1910 deserves particular attention as a watershed moment in this transformation. Commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation and conducted by educator Abraham Flexner, this report evaluated medical education throughout North America and recommended radical reforms that would standardize medical training along scientific lines. The report's recommendations were largely sound. It called for higher admission standards, more rigorous scientific training, and better clinical education. However, it also explicitly rejected traditional and natural healing approaches as unscientific, recommending that medical schools eliminate programs in herbal medicine, homeopathy, and other traditional practices. The Flexner Report's influence was enormous and long-lasting. Within a few years of its publication, most medical schools that taught traditional approaches closed their doors, while schools that embraced the new scientific model received funding and accreditation. The report effectively established allopathic medicine as the only legitimate form of medical practice, while systematically eliminating competition from traditional healing approaches regardless of their effectiveness. What made this transformation so effective was how it linked genuine improvements in medical science with systematic elimination of competition. Physicians in the early 20th century could genuinely claim that they were practicing more scientific medicine than their predecessors. Germ theory, aseptic technique, and anesthesia had revolutionized surgery and infectious disease treatment. However, this genuine scientific advance was used to justify rejecting all traditional remedies as inherently unscientific, regardless of whether these remedies worked or could be studied scientifically. The result was a kind of medical monoculture that eliminated diversity in therapeutic approaches while concentrating power and profit within the pharmaceutical industry. Natural remedies that had been used safely and effectively for centuries were dismissed as superstition without being systematically tested or evaluated. The assumption was that if traditional remedies worked, they would have been discovered by scientific medicine, and if scientific medicine hadn't discovered them, they couldn't possibly work. This circular logic created a self-perpetuating system where natural remedies were excluded from serious consideration regardless of their potential benefits. Pharmaceutical research focused exclusively on synthetic compounds that could be patented, while potentially effective natural remedies received no research funding and were systematically excluded from medical education and practice. The economics of this transformation were particularly powerful because they created feedback loops that reinforced pharmaceutical dominance. Pharmaceutical companies earned enormous profits from patented drugs, and they reinvested some of these profits in research that led to more patented drugs. They also funded medical education, professional organizations, and political lobbying that protected their interests while marginalizing natural alternatives. Natural remedies had no comparable economic power, and they were systematically excluded from the institutions that shaped medical practice. Regulatory barriers were equally important in eliminating natural remedies from medical practice. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and subsequent legislation created the Food and Drug Administration, which established standards for drug safety and efficacy that were designed primarily for synthetic pharmaceuticals rather than natural remedies. These standards were often impossible for natural remedies to meet, not because the remedies were unsafe or ineffective, but because the regulatory framework was designed around the assumption that drugs should be single purified compounds with consistent composition. Natural remedies presented regulatory challenges that this framework couldn't accommodate. Willow bark contained not just salicin but dozens of other compounds that might contribute to its therapeutic effects. St. John's wort contained multiple active compounds working through different mechanisms. Honey varied in composition depending on its floral source, season of collection, and preparation method. These natural variations were seen as problems to be eliminated rather than potential therapeutic advantages. The regulatory framework assumed that drugs should be standardized to ensure consistent effects, and that variation was inherently dangerous. This assumption made sense for single synthetic compounds, but it created impossible barriers for natural remedies that derived their effectiveness from complex mixtures of multiple active compounds. Pharmaceutical companies could standardize synthetic aspirin because they controlled every aspect of its manufacture, but medieval physicians had recognized that natural variations in willow bark were part of its therapeutic complexity rather than problems to be overcome. These regulatory barriers were compounded by liability concerns that made physicians reluctant to prescribe natural remedies even when they might be effective. Physicians trained in conventional medicine feared malpractice liability if they prescribed treatments that weren't standard of care, and natural remedies were systematically excluded from standard of care by the same forces that made pharmaceuticals dominant. Physicians who wanted to prescribe natural remedies faced professional skepticism, insurance reimbursement problems, and potential liability that created powerful disincentives for innovation or experimentation. The cultural transformation was equally profound and long-lasting. Popular culture came to associate scientific medicine with white-coated physicians in sterile laboratories developing synthetic drugs through sophisticated chemistry, while traditional remedies were associated with folk superstition, primitive practices, and unscientific thinking. This cultural narrative was actively promoted through advertising, popular media, and professional education that consistently portrayed natural remedies as outdated and dangerous while celebrating synthetic pharmaceuticals as modern miracles. The pharmaceutical industry was particularly effective at using advertising to shape public perception of natural remedies. Patent medicines of the late 19th and early 20th centuries provided legitimate grounds for concern about unregulated remedies, but the industry used these concerns to justify eliminating all natural remedies regardless of their safety or effectiveness. Advertising campaigns consistently emphasized that scientific medicine meant synthetic pharmaceuticals, while natural remedies were portrayed as relics of a primitive past that had been superseded by modern science. This cultural transformation was remarkably successful. Within a few generations, most people lost touch with traditional healing knowledge that had been passed down for centuries. Families no longer knew which herbs to use for common ailments, how to prepare medicinal remedies, or when natural approaches might be effective. Communities lost the traditional healers who had maintained this knowledge, while physicians trained in conventional medicine had no exposure to or respect for traditional approaches. The result was a kind of collective amnesia about effective natural remedies that had worked for centuries. People who might have benefited from willow bark instead used synthetic aspirin without knowing that natural alternatives existed. People with depression were prescribed pharmaceuticals without knowing that St. John's wort might work as effectively with fewer side effects. People with chronic wounds received conventional treatments without knowing that honey or maggots might achieve better results. This cultural amnesia was particularly tragic because it occurred just as scientific methods were becoming sophisticated enough to understand how these natural remedies actually worked. Modern biochemistry could have elucidated the active compounds in traditional remedies, explained their mechanisms of action, and optimized their use through better preparation and dosing. Instead, these remedies were dismissed as unscientific just as science was becoming capable of understanding them properly. Legitimate safety concerns also played a role in the disappearance of traditional remedies, though these concerns were often exaggerated or misapplied. Some traditional remedies were genuinely dangerous if used improperly. Foxglove could kill if the dose was too high, and some herbs could interact dangerously with other medications. These legitimate concerns were used to justify eliminating all traditional remedies rather than developing regulatory frameworks that would ensure safe, appropriate use. The problem wasn't that safety concerns were unfounded, but that the response was disproportionate and economically motivated. The conventional approach eliminated potentially beneficial remedies rather than developing systems to ensure their safe use. Pharmaceutical drugs were also dangerous, often more dangerous than natural remedies, but these risks were seen as acceptable because they came from scientific medicine rather than traditional practice. The interaction between St. John's wort and prescription medications provides a perfect example of how safety concerns were used to eliminate competition rather than ensure appropriate use. St. John's wort can indeed interact with other medications by affecting liver enzymes that metabolize drugs, potentially reducing the effectiveness of other treatments. This interaction is real and important, but it's also manageable through proper medical supervision and patient education. However, the pharmaceutical industry and medical establishment emphasized these interactions while downplaying St. John's wort's effectiveness as a primary treatment, using legitimate safety concerns to eliminate competition. A similar pattern occurred with many other natural remedies. Potential risks were exaggerated while benefits were minimized. creating the impression that natural remedies were inherently more dangerous than pharmaceutical alternatives, even when the opposite was often true. The result was that patients were denied access to potentially beneficial treatments while being offered pharmaceutical alternatives that carried their own significant risks. Economic interests, professional politics, regulatory barriers, cultural transformation, and legitimate safety concerns created a perfect storm that systematically eliminated traditional remedies from medical practice. The result was a medical system that was more standardized and scientifically based in some respects, but also more limited in therapeutic options and more dependent on expensive, patentable pharmaceuticals. The transformation wasn't entirely negative. Genuine advances in medical science did occur, and some dangerous or ineffective traditional practices were appropriately abandoned. However, the wholesale rejection of traditional remedies threw the baby out with the bathwater, eliminating centuries of accumulated therapeutic wisdom without proper evaluation or respect for what it might still offer. What makes this story particularly relevant today is that many of the same forces continue to operate, limiting access to natural remedies and maintaining pharmaceutical dominance despite growing evidence that many traditional approaches deserve serious consideration. The regulatory framework still favors synthetic pharmaceuticals over natural remedies. Medical education still provides little exposure to traditional healing approaches. Economic incentives still drive research and innovation toward patentable treatments rather than natural alternatives. However, the landscape is changing in ways that suggest traditional remedies may be poised for broader acceptance. The crisis of antibiotic resistance is forcing medicine to reconsider natural antimicrobial approaches. The growing burden of chronic disease is driving interest in preventive and lifestyle-based approaches that resemble traditional medicine. Healthcare costs are creating pressure for more affordable treatments that natural remedies can provide. Perhaps most importantly, patients are increasingly seeking natural alternatives to pharmaceutical treatments, creating market pressures that are beginning to influence medical practice. The Internet has made information about traditional remedies widely available, breaking the monopoly on medical information that conventional medicine once enjoyed. Growing scientific research is validating traditional remedies in ways that make them increasingly difficult to dismiss. The tragedy is that we had to wait so long for this rediscovery, and that so much knowledge was lost unnecessarily. The medieval remedies we've explored represent only a fraction of the therapeutic wisdom that was abandoned in the rush toward pharmaceutical modernity. Many other promising treatments were lost entirely, their knowledge destroyed by cultural amnesia and systematic suppression. What we're witnessing today is the gradual reconstruction of this lost knowledge through painstaking research and clinical practice. Medieval physicians achieved therapeutic success that we're only beginning to appreciate and replicate. The question moving forward is whether we can integrate ancient wisdom with modern science to create healthcare that combines the best of both worlds: sophisticated understanding of human physiology and therapeutic mechanisms alongside respect for traditional knowledge and natural healing approaches. As we'll explore in our next section, the rediscovery of these remedies is already having significant impacts on modern medicine, creating new possibilities for treating conditions that conventional approaches have struggled with. The future of medicine may well involve a synthesis of ancient and modern approaches that medieval physicians would immediately recognize and appreciate. The rediscovery and rehabilitation of medieval remedies is occurring in hospitals, research laboratories, and clinical practices worldwide, often driven by necessity rather than nostalgia. As conventional medicine confronts the limits of pharmaceutical approaches, antibiotic resistance, chronic disease epidemics, spiraling costs, and significant side effects, physicians and researchers are returning to medieval therapeutic approaches with results that are transforming medical practice and challenging long-held assumptions about what constitutes scientific medicine. The crisis of antibiotic resistance has perhaps done more than any other factor to force modern medicine's return to medieval approaches. As bacteria develop resistance to every antibiotic we throw at them, physicians are rediscovering that medieval physicians possessed antimicrobial strategies that remain effective precisely because they work through multiple mechanisms that pathogens find difficult to overcome. The medieval approach of using whole plant preparations containing dozens of active compounds is proving more resistant to resistance than single-mechanism synthetic antibiotics. Modern hospitals are increasingly using medical-grade honey for wound infections that resist conventional antibiotics. Burn units, surgical wards, and chronic wound care centers now stock honey preparations as standard treatments for infections that have defied multiple rounds of antibiotics. Clinical trials have consistently shown that honey is effective against MRSA and other multi-drug-resistant pathogens, often achieving healing in wounds that have failed to respond to months or years of conventional treatment. The medieval practice of applying honey to infected wounds is no longer alternative medicine. It's evidence-based practice supported by systematic reviews and clinical guidelines. What makes this rediscovery particularly significant is that honey's effectiveness doesn't diminish with use the way antibiotics do. Because honey works through multiple mechanisms simultaneously, osmotic pressure, hydrogen peroxide production, antimicrobial peptides, and disruption of bacterial biofilms, pathogens find it difficult to develop resistance. Medieval physicians may not have understood these mechanisms, but they observed empirically that honey remained effective generation after generation, unlike single-mechanism treatments that pathogens eventually learn to evade. Silver is also making a comeback in modern medicine, particularly in situations where infection risk is high and antibiotic options are limited. Silver-impregnated dressings are used in burn units and for surgical wounds where conventional antibiotics have failed or are contraindicated. Silver-coated medical devices reduce the risk of hospital-acquired infections in patients with compromised immune systems. Some hospitals are even returning to silver solutions for water purification and surface disinfection as resistance to chemical disinfectants increases. The sophistication of medieval silver use is particularly evident in how modern medicine is rediscovering applications that medieval physicians would recognize immediately. Silver preparations are particularly valuable for patients with compromised immune systems, burn victims, and surgical patients at high risk for infection, exactly the populations that medieval physicians treated with silver. The difference is that modern medicine now understands the mechanisms that medieval physicians observed empirically, and we can use silver more effectively as a result. Leeches have completed perhaps the most dramatic rehabilitation from medieval barbarism to modern medical device. Hospital pharmacies now stock live medicinal leeches alongside synthetic drugs, and surgeons use them daily for procedures that would have been impossible just a few decades ago. Microsurgeons reattaching severed fingers, toes, or limbs rely on leeches to maintain blood flow in reattached tissue, preventing the congestion that would otherwise cause tissue death and surgical failure. The sophistication of modern leech therapy closely resembles medieval protocols, suggesting that medieval physicians achieved optimal therapeutic approaches that have proven difficult to improve upon. Modern physicians apply leeches to specific anatomical sites for precise periods, exactly as medieval physicians did. They monitor patients for therapeutic effects and potential complications, using careful observation to guide treatment decisions. The main difference is that modern leeches are bred in sterile facilities and tested for pathogens, addressing legitimate concerns about infection that medieval physicians couldn't have understood. Maggot therapy has experienced a similar rehabilitation, moving from desperate last resort to FDA-approved medical device used in wound care centers worldwide. Diabetic foot ulcers, pressure sores, and other chronic wounds that resist conventional debridement now receive maggot therapy as standard treatment in many hospitals. Clinical trials have shown that maggots achieve superior results compared to surgical debridement for certain types of wounds, with faster healing, better cosmetic outcomes, and lower rates of amputation in diabetic patients. Medieval physicians would recognize modern maggot therapy protocols immediately. Modern physicians use specific species of sterile fly larvae, applied in precise quantities to wound areas requiring debridement, with dressings designed to keep maggots confined to appropriate areas while allowing air circulation. Exactly the approach medieval physicians developed centuries ago. The main improvement is sterility and standardization, but the fundamental therapeutic approach remains unchanged. What these examples demonstrate is that necessity is driving medical progress backward toward medieval approaches that proved effective over centuries of use. As modern medicine confronts the limits of pharmaceutical solutions, medieval remedies are being rediscovered not as alternatives but as superior treatments for conditions that conventional approaches struggle with. This isn't romantic nostalgia for a primitive past, it's practical problem-solving driven by therapeutic results. The rehabilitation of botanical remedies is occurring more slowly but just as significantly. Willow bark extract is increasingly used by patients seeking gentler alternatives to synthetic pain medications, and clinical studies confirm its effectiveness for chronic pain conditions like arthritis and fibromyalgia. Patients report comparable pain relief with fewer side effects compared to NSAIDs, exactly as medieval physicians observed. The difference is that modern patients often use willow bark without medical supervision, having discovered its benefits outside the conventional medical system. St. John's wort has achieved mainstream acceptance in some countries while remaining controversial in others, reflecting ongoing tensions between pharmaceutical and natural approaches to mental health. In Germany, St. John's wort is one of the most prescribed treatments for mild to moderate depression, supported by clinical guidelines and used by conventional physicians as first-line treatment. German physicians recognize that St. John's wort offers comparable effectiveness to synthetic antidepressants with better tolerability for many patients, exactly as medieval physicians observed centuries ago. However, in the United States, St. John's wort remains largely outside mainstream medical practice despite overwhelming scientific evidence. Most American physicians have little training in herbal medicine and may be unaware of the dozens of clinical trials supporting St. John's wort's effectiveness. Patients who find relief with St. John's wort often do so without medical supervision, creating potential risks from drug interactions that could be managed through proper medical care. What makes this geographic variation significant is that it demonstrates how cultural and economic factors continue to shape medical practice independent of scientific evidence. German physicians prescribed St. John's wort because their training included adequate exposure to herbal medicine and because their healthcare system supports its use. American physicians avoid St. John's wort not because it doesn't work, but because their training excluded herbal medicine and because systemic factors make pharmaceutical approaches more convenient and professionally acceptable. The rehabilitation of medieval remedies is also driven by growing awareness of chronic disease and lifestyle medicine approaches that resemble medieval holistic practice. Modern medicine increasingly recognizes that chronic conditions like diabetes, heart disease, and depression require comprehensive approaches addressing diet, exercise, stress management, and social factors alongside specific treatments. This recognition is leading medicine back toward the medieval understanding that health involves the whole person, not isolated organ systems or biochemical pathways. Medieval physicians would immediately recognize modern lifestyle medicine approaches that emphasize prevention, individualized treatment, and addressing root causes rather than suppressing symptoms. They would understand the modern recognition that diet affects every aspect of health, that stress contributes to physical illness, that sleep and exercise are fundamental to healing, and that emotional and spiritual well-being affect physical health. This holistic perspective, dismissed as unscientific for generations, is now recognized as essential for addressing chronic disease. Integrative medicine clinics are increasingly combining conventional treatments with medieval remedies like valerian for anxiety, garlic for cardiovascular health, and yarrow for wound healing. These clinics recognize that both ancient and modern approaches have value, and that the most effective treatment often combines the best of both worlds. Patients receive conventional diagnoses and monitoring while also benefiting from traditional remedies that offer improved tolerability and effectiveness for certain conditions. Monastic herb gardens are experiencing a remarkable revival as medical institutions rediscover the value of growing medicinal plants for research and teaching. Some medical schools now maintain herb gardens where students learn about plant medicine alongside conventional pharmacology. These gardens serve as living laboratories where researchers can study how growing conditions, harvesting times, and preparation methods affect the medicinal properties of traditional remedies. The University of Würzburg in Germany has perhaps the most sophisticated program integrating medieval and modern medicine. Medical students there study medieval herbals alongside modern pharmacology, learning to appreciate the empirical wisdom embedded in traditional texts while understanding these remedies through modern scientific frameworks. They learn to prepare traditional remedies, understand their mechanisms of action, and integrate them appropriately with conventional treatments. Other institutions are following similar paths. Medical schools in the United States, the United Kingdom, and other countries are increasingly offering courses in medical history and integrative medicine that expose students to traditional healing approaches. These courses don't replace conventional medical training, but they broaden students' perspectives and equip them to evaluate traditional remedies scientifically rather than dismissing them automatically. The economic pressures driving this transformation are as significant as the therapeutic ones. Healthcare costs are becoming unsustainable throughout the developed world, creating powerful incentives to identify effective, affordable treatments that don't depend on expensive patented pharmaceuticals. Natural remedies offer potential solutions to this economic challenge, providing effective treatments at significantly lower cost than synthetic alternatives. Health insurance companies are beginning to recognize the economic benefits of covering certain natural remedies. Some insurers now cover medical-grade honey for wound care, medicinal leeches for microsurgical procedures, and even acupuncture or herbal treatments for chronic pain. These coverage decisions aren't based on ideology but on economic analysis showing that natural remedies can reduce overall healthcare costs while maintaining or improving patient outcomes. The pharmaceutical industry's response to this transformation has been mixed and evolving. Initially, pharmaceutical companies fought against the rehabilitation of natural remedies, funding research that emphasized risks while downplaying benefits and lobbying against regulatory changes that would make natural remedies more accessible. However, some companies are now exploring opportunities to develop standardized natural remedies that can be patented and sold as pharmaceuticals. This pharmaceutical interest has led to development of phytopharmaceuticals, standardized plant extracts that undergo clinical testing and regulatory approval similar to synthetic drugs. Pharmaceutical companies are developing standardized St. John's wort extracts, valerian preparations, and other botanical remedies that offer some of the benefits of natural treatments while maintaining pharmaceutical quality control and profitability. This development is controversial among advocates of traditional medicine because it represents another form of pharmaceutical appropriation, transforming traditional remedies into patented products that can be sold at enormous profit. However, it also represents progress toward broader acceptance of plant medicine within conventional healthcare, potentially improving patient access to treatments that work. The rehabilitation of medieval remedies is also occurring in unexpected areas of modern medicine. Dentistry is rediscovering medieval approaches to oral health that emphasized prevention and natural remedies alongside mechanical cleaning. Some dentists now recommend natural antimicrobial agents like honey and propolis for gum health, recognizing that these remedies can complement conventional dental care without the side effects of chemical mouthwashes. Veterinary medicine is also embracing medieval remedies in ways that precede human medical acceptance. Veterinarians often have greater flexibility than physicians in using unapproved treatments, and many have discovered that natural remedies offer safe, effective options for animals who can't tolerate pharmaceutical side effects. Honey for wound healing, valerian for anxiety, and willow bark for pain relief are increasingly common in veterinary practice, often with results that exceed conventional treatments. Military medicine represents another area where necessity is driving the rehabilitation of medieval approaches. Field hospitals in combat zones often lack access to sophisticated medical technology and supply chains, creating interest in effective treatments that can be prepared locally using available resources. Military physicians are rediscovering medieval wound treatments, infection control methods, and pain management approaches that remain effective in resource-limited environments. What makes military interest particularly significant is that it's driven purely by results rather than ideology or economics. Military physicians will use whatever works to save lives and restore function, regardless of whether treatments are ancient or modern. The fact that medieval remedies are proving effective in these demanding circumstances provides perhaps the strongest validation that these treatments deserve serious consideration in civilian healthcare. The rehabilitation of medieval remedies is also being supported by growing scientific research that uses modern methods to understand ancient treatments. Pharmacologists are isolating active compounds from traditional remedies, elucidating their mechanisms of action, and understanding how these compounds work together to produce therapeutic effects. This research is building bridges between traditional empirical knowledge and modern scientific understanding. What's particularly fascinating about this research is that it's revealing why medieval remedies often work better than synthetic alternatives. The multi-compound, multi-target approach of natural remedies appears to provide more balanced therapeutic effects with fewer side effects than single-compound drugs. Medieval physicians couldn't have understood these mechanisms, but they observed empirically that whole plant preparations worked better than isolated compounds in many situations. The future of medicine may well involve intentional integration of medieval and modern approaches that combines empirical wisdom with scientific understanding. Already, some physicians are practicing what might be called evidence-based traditional medicine, using traditional remedies that have been validated by modern research, understanding their mechanisms of action, monitoring patients appropriately, and integrating these treatments with conventional care when beneficial. This integrated approach recognizes that both medieval and modern medicine have value, and that the ideal treatment often combines insights from both traditions. Patients can receive accurate diagnosis through modern technology while benefiting from traditional remedies that offer therapeutic advantages for their specific condition. Physicians can draw from the full range of therapeutic options rather than limiting themselves to treatments developed within the past century. The transformation is far from complete, and significant barriers remain to full integration of medieval remedies into modern healthcare. Regulatory frameworks still favor synthetic pharmaceuticals over natural remedies. Medical education still provides inadequate exposure to traditional healing approaches. Economic incentives still drive research and innovation toward patentable treatments. Cultural assumptions still associate scientific medicine exclusively with synthetic drugs. However, the direction of change is clear and accelerating. As conventional medicine confronts its limitations and patients demand access to natural remedies, the medical establishment is gradually becoming more open to therapeutic approaches that would have been dismissed as quackery just a generation ago. The rehabilitation of medieval remedies represents not regression to primitive practices, but progress toward more comprehensive, effective healthcare that draws on the full range of human therapeutic knowledge. As we stand at the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern science, the challenge becomes how to integrate medieval remedies safely and effectively into contemporary healthcare. The evidence supporting these 12 treatments is compelling, but responsible use requires understanding both benefits and risks, recognizing when traditional approaches are appropriate and when modern medicine remains essential, and developing frameworks that allow patients and physicians to make informed decisions about integrating ancient and modern therapies. This final section provides practical guidance for navigating this complex terrain, distinguishing genuine therapeutic wisdom from dangerous misinformation, and moving toward healthcare that embraces the best of both worlds. The first principle of evidence-based integration is recognizing that medieval remedies, like all medical treatments, have both benefits and risks that must be carefully balanced. Willow bark extract effectively treats pain and inflammation for many people with fewer gastrointestinal side effects than synthetic NSAIDs, but it can still cause stomach irritation in sensitive individuals and shouldn't be used by people with aspirin allergies or certain bleeding disorders. St. John's wort works as effectively as prescription antidepressants for many patients with fewer side effects, but it interacts with numerous medications and requires careful supervision when taken with other drugs. Valerian promotes sleep and reduces anxiety naturally, but it can cause daytime drowsiness in some people and shouldn't be combined with alcohol or sedative medications. Understanding these risk-benefit profiles requires going beyond romantic notions about natural remedies being inherently safe and recognizing that any effective treatment carries risks that must be managed appropriately. Medieval physicians understood this reality through bitter experience. They learned which remedies worked for which patients, what doses were appropriate, what side effects to watch for, and when treatments were contraindicated. Modern patients need access to similar knowledge, presented in ways that support informed decision-making rather than promoting either uncritical acceptance or automatic rejection of traditional remedies. The second principle involves distinguishing between traditional remedies that have been validated by modern research and those that remain purely speculative or have been disproven. The 12 remedies we've explored have substantial scientific support from clinical trials, laboratory studies, and systematic reviews. However, medieval medicine also included treatments that don't work or are actively dangerous: mercury for syphilis, bloodletting for fever, and various toxic substances that caused more harm than good. Responsible integration requires applying the same scientific standards to traditional remedies that we apply to modern drugs, evaluating each treatment on its evidence rather than accepting or rejecting traditional medicine as a whole. This distinction becomes particularly important as interest in traditional remedies grows and misinformation spreads rapidly through social media and alternative health communities. Some practitioners promote traditional remedies for conditions they can't possibly help, make unrealistic claims about effectiveness, or minimize genuine risks. Patients need reliable sources of information that present traditional remedies accurately, distinguishing evidence-based uses from speculative applications and honestly reporting both benefits and risks. Quality control represents a third crucial principle for safe integration of medieval remedies. One reason these treatments fell out of favor was legitimate concern about variable potency and contamination, a problem that persists today with herbal supplements. Medieval physicians addressed quality control through careful selection of plant material, standardized preparation methods, and detailed knowledge of optimal growing conditions, harvesting times, and storage methods. Modern patients need access to similar quality assurance, but the supplement industry's limited regulation means that products vary enormously in quality and purity. Patients seeking to use traditional remedies need to identify reliable manufacturers who test their products for purity, potency, and contamination. Third-party testing organizations like Consumer Lab, NSF International, and the United States Pharmacopoeia provide independent verification that supplements contain what their labels claim without harmful contaminants. These quality assurance programs are essential for safe use of traditional remedies, addressing legitimate concerns that led to these treatments being abandoned in the first place. The fourth principle involves appropriate medical supervision and integration with conventional care. Patients shouldn't use traditional remedies as substitutes for necessary medical treatment, nor should they assume that natural products are safe to combine with prescription medications. The most effective approach integrates medieval remedies with conventional medicine under appropriate medical supervision, recognizing that both have roles to play and that professional guidance maximizes benefits while minimizing risks. Physicians need training in traditional remedies to provide appropriate supervision, and medical education must evolve to include evidence-based traditional medicine alongside conventional pharmacology. Some pioneering medical schools are developing curricula that teach students to evaluate traditional remedies scientifically, understand their mechanisms of action, recognize potential drug interactions, and integrate these treatments appropriately with conventional care. This educational evolution is essential for creating healthcare providers who can help patients navigate the full range of therapeutic options safely and effectively. The fifth principle concerns when to use traditional remedies versus when conventional medicine remains superior. Medieval remedies work beautifully for certain conditions: willow bark and St. John's wort for chronic pain and mild-moderate depression, honey and silver for wound infections, leeches for circulatory congestion, valerian for anxiety and insomnia. However, modern medicine remains vastly superior for many other conditions: acute bacterial infections requiring broad-spectrum antibiotics, childhood leukemia and other cancers requiring chemotherapy and radiation, heart attacks requiring emergency intervention, and countless other situations where medieval medicine lacked effective treatments. The most appropriate approach recognizes that different conditions require different therapeutic strategies, and that both medieval and modern medicine have important roles to play. Patients with chronic conditions that haven't responded well to conventional treatment might benefit from traditional remedies that offer different therapeutic mechanisms. Patients with acute life-threatening conditions need immediate access to modern emergency medicine. The goal is therapeutic flexibility, not ideological purity in either direction. The sixth principle involves understanding why medieval physicians achieved therapeutic success with these remedies and how their approaches can inform modern practice. Medieval physicians worked within holistic frameworks that recognized connections between different aspects of health: physical, emotional, social, and spiritual. They treated the whole person rather than isolated symptoms, recognizing that healing required addressing underlying causes and supporting the body's natural healing capacity while providing specific symptomatic relief. This holistic understanding, dismissed as unscientific for generations, is increasingly recognized as essential for optimal healthcare. Modern medicine excels at acute intervention and specific treatments for well-defined diseases, but struggles with chronic conditions, preventive medicine, and health promotion, areas where medieval approaches often excelled. The future of medicine may well involve combining modern diagnostic precision and interventional capabilities with medieval attention to lifestyle, environment, emotional health, and natural healing capacity. Integrating medieval remedies also requires recognizing what made these treatments effective in their original contexts and how to replicate those conditions in modern practice. Medieval physicians used fresh plant material gathered at optimal times, prepared using methods that preserved active compounds, and administered in ways that supported overall health. Modern patients using dried, processed, or poorly prepared herbal products may not achieve the same results that medieval physicians observed. Some researchers are working to bridge this gap by studying optimal cultivation, harvesting, and preparation methods for medicinal plants. These researchers are rediscovering that plants grown in specific soils, harvested at specific times, and prepared using traditional methods often possess superior therapeutic properties compared to mass-produced alternatives. This research is leading to development of cultivated medicinal plant gardens and traditional preparation facilities that can provide high-quality remedies to healthcare systems. The final principle involves regulatory reform to create pathways for integrating traditional remedies into mainstream medicine. Current regulatory frameworks designed for synthetic pharmaceuticals don't accommodate natural remedies well, creating barriers that limit access to treatments that could benefit patients. Reform efforts should create categories for traditional remedies that have demonstrated safety and effectiveness, establishing standards for quality, labeling, and professional use without imposing the impossible burdens of drug approval on treatments with centuries of documented safe use. Some countries are already moving in this direction. Germany's Commission E evaluated traditional herbal remedies for safety and effectiveness, creating monographs for hundreds of traditional treatments that guide physicians and pharmacists. The World Health Organization has developed guidelines for traditional medicine that recognize its role in healthcare worldwide. Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration created a category for listed complementary medicines with lower regulatory burdens than registered medicines. Similar approaches in other countries could make traditional remedies more available while maintaining appropriate safety standards. The challenge moving forward is creating healthcare systems that embrace therapeutic wisdom wherever it's found, evaluating treatments based on evidence rather than ideology, and providing patients with access to the full range of options that might benefit them. This doesn't mean abandoning modern medicine or romanticizing medieval practices. It means taking the best from both traditions and integrating them in ways that serve patient needs effectively and safely. Patients seeking to use medieval remedies today should start by consulting reliable sources of information that present balanced assessments of benefits and risks. They should discuss traditional remedies with their healthcare providers, providing full disclosure about supplements and alternative treatments to avoid dangerous interactions. They should choose high-quality products from reputable manufacturers who test for purity and potency. They should use traditional remedies for conditions where evidence supports their effectiveness while maintaining appropriate conventional care for conditions where modern medicine remains superior. Healthcare providers need training in traditional medicine that enables them to provide informed guidance to patients seeking alternatives or adjuncts to conventional treatment. They need access to reliable information about traditional remedies, training in potential interactions and contraindications, and willingness to consider therapeutic options outside conventional practice when evidence supports their use. They also need legal and professional protections that enable them to recommend traditional remedies without fear of malpractice liability when their recommendations are based on evidence and appropriate patient selection. Medical education must evolve to include traditional medicine alongside conventional pharmacology, teaching students to evaluate all treatments scientifically regardless of their origin. Medical schools should maintain herb gardens, offer courses in medical history and traditional healing, and provide clinical experiences in integrative medicine settings. This education shouldn't replace conventional training but complement it, creating physicians who can draw from the full range of human therapeutic knowledge rather than limiting themselves to treatments developed in the past century. Research funding should support continued investigation of traditional remedies, using modern methods to understand why these treatments work, how to optimize their use, and when they're most appropriate. This research should be conducted with appropriate scientific rigor while respecting the empirical wisdom embedded in traditional practices. Rather than dismissing traditional remedies as unscientific, researchers should approach them with the same methodological standards they apply to conventional treatments, determining mechanisms of action, optimal dosing, potential interactions, and appropriate clinical applications. The healthcare industry needs economic models that support sustainable access to traditional remedies without transforming them into expensive patentable products that exclude patients who most need them. This might involve community-based production, cooperative manufacturing, or innovative payment models that ensure access while maintaining quality. The goal should be preserving the democratic accessibility that made many traditional remedies valuable while ensuring they meet appropriate quality and safety standards. As we reach the end of our exploration of these 12 medieval remedies, what becomes clear is that their disappearance represented a significant loss of therapeutic knowledge that we're only beginning to recover. Medieval physicians achieved remarkable results using natural treatments, empirical observation, and holistic approaches that modern medicine is rediscovering as valuable complements to conventional care. The tragedy isn't that medieval medicine was perfect. It clearly wasn't. But that effective treatments were abandoned without proper evaluation, and that patients suffered needlessly as a result. The recovery of this lost knowledge comes at a crucial moment in medical history. We face epidemics of chronic disease that conventional medicine struggles to treat effectively. We confront antibiotic resistance that threatens to return us to the pre-antibiotic era. Healthcare costs are becoming unsustainable, limiting access to conventional treatments for millions of people. Traditional remedies offer potential solutions to these challenges, providing effective treatments for many conditions at significantly lower cost and with fewer side effects than pharmaceutical alternatives. The integration of medieval remedies into modern healthcare represents progress rather than regression, progress toward more comprehensive, effective, and sustainable medicine that draws on the full range of human therapeutic knowledge. This integration requires careful scientific evaluation, appropriate regulation, professional education, and cultural acceptance of therapeutic approaches that have stood the test of time but were abandoned for reasons having more to do with economics than effectiveness. As patients, we have the right to benefit from both ancient and modern medical wisdom. As citizens, we have the responsibility to support healthcare systems that embrace therapeutic diversity rather than pharmaceutical monopoly. As human beings, we have the opportunity to learn from our ancestors' hard-won knowledge while contributing our own insights to the ongoing evolution of healing arts. The journey toward integrating medieval remedies into modern healthcare has only begun, but the direction is clear. Each year brings more research validating traditional treatments, more physicians willing to consider natural alternatives, more patients demanding access to proven traditional remedies, and more recognition that medical progress doesn't always mean abandoning the past. The future of medicine may well be one that medieval physicians would recognize and appreciate, one that combines sophisticated understanding with respect for traditional wisdom, that treats the whole person rather than isolated systems, and that draws on nature's pharmacy as well as humanity's laboratories. What's happening now at the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern science gives me hope for the future of medicine. We're witnessing the gradual emergence of healthcare that's more effective, more affordable, more humane, and more sustainable than what we've had for generations. This transformation isn't happening quickly, and significant barriers remain, but the momentum is building as evidence accumulates and attitudes change. The medieval physicians who developed these remedies through centuries of careful observation would be pleased to know their work wasn't in vain, and that future generations are rediscovering and validating their therapeutic wisdom. If you found this deep dive into medieval medicine valuable and want to continue exploring the fascinating intersections of ancient wisdom and modern science, please like this video and subscribe to History for Deep Sleep. Your support helps me continue creating these detailed explorations of topics that have been forgotten, misunderstood, or unfairly dismissed. And let me know in the comments which medieval remedy you found most surprising or useful, and whether you've had personal experience with any of these treatments. It's always fascinating to hear from our community about these journeys into lost knowledge, and your insights help shape future videos.